Good morning, thank you for joining us. The sermon title this morning is Do You Want to Get Well? Do you want to get well? And on the surface, that can seem like a really strange question for someone to ask. Particularly as we're going to see in a moment, it was addressed to a person who had been suffering for many, many years. And Jesus is the one who poses the question, do you want to get well? Oftentimes when Jesus asked questions, it wasn't so much that he can gain information, more it was an opportunity to teach. It was an opportunity to cause the people who he was speaking to reflect, to pause, to actually learn something. And my prayer this morning is that all of us, that we can learn something from this question that Jesus asked. We're going to be continuing our study in the Gospel of John, and we're going to pick up in John chapter 5 and verse 1. It says, "Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, 'Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well?' This pool, called Bethesda, had a legend surrounding it. And in some of your Bibles, you may see that verse 4 has been relegated to the footnotes. That's because it doesn't appear in some of the earliest manuscripts. And the theory is that it was added by a later copyist to explain why there were so many sick people in this area. And as the legend goes, that from time to time, this pool, the waters would stir, would bubble up. People thought it was an angel from heaven would come down and touch the water and stir up the water. And as the story went, the first person who would enter the pool after it had been stirred up would be healed or cured of whatever ailment they were suffering with. And so a great number of sick people would gather in this area waiting for the waters to be stirred. And Jesus is here, and this pool is located just north of the temple, northeast, and Jesus is coming through the area. He's in Jerusalem for one of the festivals. We're not sure which festival, it's unnamed, but typically there were 3 main Jewish festivals that all Jewish men were expected to travel to Jerusalem to attend worship at the temple, and that was the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And so Jesus is here for the festival, but he comes to Bethesda, the pool of Bethesda, and he finds this man who has been lying here by the pool for 38 years, and he's paralyzed. And Jesus asks him the question, do you want to get well? 38 years is a long time. That's really hard for most of us to even imagine what it'd be like to suffer for that length of time. I remember getting sick back in 2012 with a type of land sickness called mal-de-débarquement syndrome, or MDDS, and the illness brought on just it was like being seasick except you're on land, and so it brought on nausea and dizziness and migraines and vomiting, and I was ill with this for about 3 months. And it happened again in 2015. Typically it occurs if you've been on a cruise. And back then, my father-in-law had paid for my wife and I to go on a cruise. And that was the first time I came down with it. And that first bout of sickness, I saw specialist after specialist, particularly as the migraines were the biggest challenge. I would be lying on my bed, the room would be spinning, I would be throwing up, I couldn't stand, couldn't walk, and it was just horrible. And honestly, at some point, I was getting so discouraged, I thought, I may never recover from this. And especially as the days turned into weeks, and then the weeks turned into months, and it was just utterly demoralizing, discouraging, depressing. It was horrible. And then suddenly, with almost 3 months to the day, one day I just woke up and the room wasn't spinning, and I didn't have a migraine. And And I just felt this overwhelming sense of relief. I think I may even have shed a tear, but it was just this, oh my goodness, life could go on. But here's a fella who's been sick for 38 years, paralyzed for 38 years, surrounded by other sick people. I can't imagine what the environment would have been like. I can't imagine just how he would have felt about being in this situation. But then Jesus comes and says, do you want to get well? You think, wow, that's a really strange question. You know, just to put it into context, 38 years. 38 years ago would be 1983. That was when I was in my first year of A-levels at my boarding school, and I think that was the year that Michael Jackson's Thriller album came out, and that was the year I remember the Thriller video being released later on in the year, and being at school with all my school friends gathered around that little television set there, and we're all crowding around to watch this really hyped up video, and it was incredible for its time. The special effects, it was just amazing. But now you look back at it and you think, well, it's all so dated, but at the time it was unbelievable. I think 1983 was the year they brought out CDs, compact discs, and yeah, kids born today, they wouldn't understand, well, what is a compact disc? It's obsolete now, but back then it was the cutting edge of technology. We didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have so many things that we take for granted now. But that was 38 years ago. Can you imagine being ill and sick all that length of time, and then someone comes up to you and says, do you want to get well? You know, what's interesting is, as we read this story here in John 5, there is legitimate reason to question whether this guy really did want to get well or not. And I remember as a young Christian, sometimes we would use this text in group Bible discussions and have a poll, have a vote to see who thinks this guy really did want to get well, and who thought he really didn't want to get well, even though he may have indicated that he did. And some of the clues, you think about this, right? If it were true that this pool had healing properties, you would think that someone who was really desperate to be healed would position themselves in such a way that they would get into the pool first. I mean, you would imagine after 38 years of trying and not being successful that perhaps you wouldn't position yourself so far away from the pool. If you'd perch on the very edge of the pool, so that as soon as that water stirred, you just roll over and in you go. I mean, something along those lines. Or you might at least have a plan, so you've got some friends around you to help you to get into the pool. Or you know, I mean, you just think, surely after 38 years you would find a way. And so the question maybe isn't necessarily as ridiculous as it may seem at first glance. But then later on, as we carry on reading the story, you'll see some other potential indicators that this man might not be all that you would expect. Let's carry on in verse 7, because look at this response to a simple yes or no question: do you want to get well? His response in verse 7 is, "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. Now, when you read this passage, you could be forgiven for thinking that this fella doesn't seem to be particularly grateful for the incredible miracle that Jesus did for him. First of all, when he's questioned by the Jewish authorities for why is he carrying the mat on the Sabbath. And by the way, carrying his mat on the Sabbath is nowhere mentioned as breaking the Mosaic law in anywhere in the Old Testament. This was one of those traditions that had been added on by the Jewish religious leaders over the years, and they had added on more and more rules to make sure that you didn't break the original rules, and this was one of those rules that was really a tradition of man rather than a command of God. But nonetheless, they questioned him, why are you carrying your mat on the Sabbath? And his response was, the man who made me well told me to pick up your mat and walk. Well, maybe he didn't realize that he was getting Jesus into trouble. I don't know. But certainly, it gives you pause for thought. Then they ask him, well, who is this fellow? And his response is, actually, I have no idea. He didn't even ask the name of his benefactor. See, again, possibly there were crowds there, and so possibly with everything going on, with his sudden healing, his ability to walk, maybe Jesus slipped away before he had time to ask who it was, and so maybe he wasn't being disingenuous, but he didn't know Jesus' name. Later in verse 14, Jesus finds him at the temple, and Jesus says to him, "See you're well, stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." Now, I don't know why Jesus said that in that way, stop sinning. Had he caught the man in a sin? Was the guy back at the temple perhaps begging for as he used to do, even though now he was healed? We don't really know. And so it can be taken a couple of ways. But immediately after that, then the man goes away and he finds the Jewish leaders and he tells them, "It was Jesus who made me well." Did he know that he was being a snitch and getting Jesus into hot water? Because after this, then the Jews begin to step up and ramp up their plans to actually kill Jesus. But maybe this fella, he was fearful about the consequences that he personally could suffer, because if you were accused of breaking Sabbath law, potentially you could be excommunicated, put out of the synagogue, or even you could be executed. You could be put to death because breaking the Sabbath was a death penalty crime. And so who knows, maybe he was just trying to take the heat off himself. We don't really know. But I do think there are some lessons that all of us can learn from this situation. Do you want to get well? Because sometimes we can be in situations, we can be facing long-term problems and challenges that we don't really know how to deal with. And potentially we could actually become so comfortable with those problems that we stop looking for solutions. That in the end, the pain of change becomes more than the pain or discomfort that we find ourselves in, and so we're just happy to stick with what we know. I really hope and I really pray that every single one of us can learn from this passage about really seeing things through and wanting to be made whole. That's another translation of the question, do you want to be made whole? Because that's God's desire for every one of us. And whatever the challenge you're facing, whether it's a perpetual sin in your life, whether it's a difficult relationship, whether it's a challenge at work, or whether it's a difficult circumstance that is beyond your control, we can find ourselves in a position where we just feel helpless and hopeless, and we can get down and discouraged, and it can be just a miserable place to be. There are three things that I think that we can take away from this passage. I'm sure there are many more than three things, but there's three things that I'm going to mention, and the first one is that of finding friends. Finding friends. This fella, when Jesus asked him, do you want to get well? He said, I've got no one to help me. And honestly, that is a big thing. Ecclesiastes 4 verses 9 and 10, it tells us that two are better than one because they get a good return for their work. He says, pity the person who falls down and has no one to help him up. And that is so true in life, that when we try and do things on our own, it's never as good as if we have someone else, a partner who's helping us. And that's true of things like, I've been going back to the gym to lose the lockdown belly. And I find that when I'm working out on my own, I never push myself as hard as when I'm working out perhaps in a class or with other people or with a partner. And there's something about having someone there with you. The last time my son-in-law visited, Jack, we went to the gym and so we worked out together. And he's what, some 25 years younger than me, and so he's younger, he's stronger, he's fitter, and all the rest of it. But the old competitive spirit kicks in, and so if he's benching 80 kgs, well, I've got to bench 90 kgs. If he's squatting 100 kgs, well, I've got to do 110 and injure my back in the process. But it's not even an overt thing. It's just a subtle, subliminal. I want to keep up. I want to try harder. And I went to a early morning gym class today, and when there's other people in the class and you're all doing the same workout, you're measuring yourself against other people, and so it helps you to push yourself harder and faster. And this fella here, he didn't have friends to help him into the pool. And so if there's one point that we can all take away is find friends. Find friends. Seriously, if you may say, well, I don't have friends who are willing to help. Hey, you found us. You found us online. Get in touch. We'll be happy to just really get involved and help you, because that's what Christians do. We are called to be a light for the world, to be the salt of the earth, to have that kind of influence and positive impact on our communities and on the world around us. And so get in touch if you need help. But find friends. This fellow, if he had some friends to help him in the pool, maybe he wouldn't have been there for nearly 4 decades. But find friends is the first thing. But second thing is focus forward. Focus forward, because in this situation, when Jesus asked him, do you want to get well, his first response, instead of yes, I would love to be healed, or yes, I want to get well, instead his response is, I've got no one to help me, and then while I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me, and both those things are probably true and valid. But you notice how he's just focusing on the obstacles. Notice how he's just looking back on why he's not been able to find healing after all these years, when right in front of him is Jesus, the great physician, the one who through whom all life was created, the great healer. Jesus, right there and then, had the power and the authority to heal this man completely. Focus forward. Because if all we're doing is focusing on the problems and all the negative stuff around us and all the obstacles, then we stop looking for the solutions. We stop looking for, for the possibilities. And instead, if we're focused on, wow, this is impossible, then usually it will be. I love the movie Good Will Hunting. Matt Damon, Robin Williams. There's a scene in there where Matt Damon, he's a janitor. He's this child genius, but he hides his light under a bushel, and he keeps low profile. So he's working as a janitor in a very prestigious university, and as he's cleaning the classrooms, he sees this maths problem on the blackboard. And so he takes a break from his cleaning and he solves this maths problem. This maths problem was some impossible, unsolved problem. And he just takes his time and solves it, and then carries on with his cleaning. And then later the professor comes in and tries to track down who solved this problem. This is unbelievable. That scene was actually based on a true life occurrence. Back in 1939, there was this young student by the name of George Danson, I think his name was, and he was at actually his name was Danzig, George Danzig. and he was in his first year at the University of Berkeley in California, and he was doing his a math class, and what happens is, and I'm gonna read his account from an interview he did back in 1986 for a maths journal. He said, this happened during my first year at Berkeley. I arrived late one day at one of Professor Niemann's classes. On the blackboard, there were two problems that I assumed had been assigned for homework. I copied them down, and a few days later I apologized to Professor Niemann for taking so long to do the homework. The problems seemed to be a little harder than usual. I asked him if he still wanted them. He told me to throw it on his desk, and I did. I did so reluctantly, because his desk was covered with such a heap of papers that I feared my homework would be lost forever. About 6 weeks later, one Sunday morning, about 8 o'clock, my wife Anne and I were awakened by someone banging on our front door, and it was Professor Niemann. He rushed in with papers in hand, all excited. "I've just written an introduction to one of your papers. Read it so I can send it out right away for publication." And for a minute, I had no idea what he was talking about. To make a long story short, the problems on the blackboard that I had solved, thinking they were homework, were in fact two famous unsolved problems in statistics. That was the first inkling I had that there was anything special about them. You know, these unsolved maths problems that the maths community had no answers to. This first year university student, he didn't realise they were meant to be unsolvable, and so he thought they were homework, and so he spent some extra time, and eventually he actually, and now clearly the guy is a genius, but nonetheless, if he'd gone in there thinking, wow, I just can't do this, then he probably wouldn't have done it. If he'd thought, well, now these are unsolvable, then he probably wouldn't have put in the effort to solve them. The point is this: when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances or challenging situations, don't just focus on the negatives. And this isn't about the power of positive thinking, although I'd rather be in a negative situation or challenging situation with someone who is positive than negative. But what this is about is never stop looking for the answers. Never stop looking for. Don't talk yourself out of finding what you're really looking for. Don't assume, well, there's all these obstacles, so it's just impossible. We need to find friends, but we need to focus forward, and finally we need to finish ugly. Finish ugly. What do I mean by that? I did a London marathon a number of years ago. And actually, I really trained hard for it, and I had a goal to finish in under 4 hours. And people asked me, so what's the goal you set yourself? And I said, 4 hours. But secretly in my heart, I was actually looking to do it in maybe 3 hours and 3 hours and 45 minutes, 3 hours and 40 minutes. I mean, I had a secret desire to really just smash it on my first attempt, and that was my goal. And my training has been going well, but then on the day itself, oh my goodness, it all fell to pieces. Number one, I'd been sick the 2 days leading up to the marathon, and I was tempted, very tempted. I was in bed. I had a terrible cold, and I was tempted to pull out. But when you've put in so much effort, you don't want to quit on the last day, and so I decided I'm going to go anyway. And so I went down there for the start of the race, and I got caught up with the atmosphere. There were literally thousands of people there, and it was exciting. And then I set off with the rest of the group, and all my training had gone out the window. Instead of sticking to a fixed pace that I'd set for myself, I went off and tried to keep up with the people around me who were much fitter, had much more experience than I was, and it went well for about the first half marathon. And I remember I got to 13, finished, got halfway, 14-mile stage, and in 1 hour and 40 minutes. And so I was feeling pretty good about, I just done a half. That was actually one of my best times. And I was thinking, wow, I really can maybe I can, if I carry on with this, I can get to maybe 3 hours and 45 minutes, 3 hours and 50. But you know what? Within another mile, by mile 14 and a half, I developed this horrible cramp in my leg, and to the point where actually I couldn't even run. I had to hobble, and one of the St. John's ambulance people saw me, and he pulled me over and he gave me a massage, and I was able to carry on for a bit. And then I thought I got to make up for lost time, and then I messed up again, and my cramp came back, and then someone else pulled me over and gave me another massage, and but by the end it was forget trying to make up the time. It's like I just want to finish the race. And it was horrible, and when people ask me what my time was, I say, well, I finished the marathon. But actually it was about 5.5 hours, and it was horrible. But I finished. And you know, the thing my mother would always say is just never quit, never give up. And you know, this fella here, he's faced with this challenge of, you know, his ill health, and Jesus has the answer. He's standing right before him. At least the guy stayed by the pool. At least he remained there. At least there was a glimmer of perseverance and persistence, whether in spite of the obstacles. And for us, we may not finish a race, we may not finish looking pretty, we may not finish it looking smooth, it may be in fact maybe pretty ugly. But if you have to finish ugly, just do whatever you need to do. Just finish. Don't quit, don't give up, don't stop for whatever reason. You know, there's a story of these two frogs that fell into a churn of milk, and someone wrote a poem about it. I just want to read this to you. It says, 2 frogs fell into a can of cream, or so I've heard it told. The sides of the can were shiny and steep, the cream was deep and cold. Oh, what's the use, croaked number 1. 'Tis fate, no help's around. Goodbye, my friends, goodbye, sad world, and weeping still, he drowned. But number 2, of sterner stuff, dog paddled in surprise. Then while he wiped his creamy face and dried his creamy eyes, I'll swim a while at least, he said, or so I've heard he said. It really wouldn't help the world if one more frog was dead. An hour or 2 he kicked and swam, not once he stopped to mutter, but kicked and swam and kicked, then hopped out via butter. I love that. I love that image of this frog just not quitting and kicking up so much that eventually the cream turns into butter, and he's able to get a foothold so he can jump out. And you know, seriously, for all of us, whatever your challenge, whatever your circumstance, God wants you to finish the race. You know what Jesus said to this fella here when he found him later at the temple? He said, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. You know what could be worse than being paralyzed for nearly 40 years, lying amongst a group of other very sick people and having no life? That's horrible, for 40 years. But Jesus says, stop sinning or something worse may happen. You know, our problems, whatever circumstances we have to deal with in life, whatever challenges, whether it's family challenges, bereavement, illness, health, whatever it is, the biggest problem we face is that of sin. Because sin can harm us not just in this lifetime, but literally for all eternity. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. There's nothing worse than being separated from a loving God, from our Heavenly Father, for all of eternity. There's nothing worse than that. And Jesus' desire is that we, all of us, might be saved from whatever it is that would stop us from making it to heaven. You know, the challenges in this life may be harsh, heavy, severe. But God allows difficulties to come our way to drive us, to steer us towards Him. He's there. He wants to help us. He wants us to be made whole. Oh, maybe not in your job, maybe not in your relationships, maybe not even in your health, but certainly to have your heart healed from the devastating impact of sin. And God's desire is that all of us will one day finish the race and be welcomed into heaven, where we can enjoy that communion with our Heavenly Father, and all the concerns of this world will be nothing but a dream. The question this morning is, do you want to get well?